Some historical facts are just too bizarre to believe. What famous video game company was around at the same time as Jack the Ripper? What prehistoric animal was still alive at the time the pyramids were being built? Who is Mike the Headless Chicken? Watch and find out. Alright, how insane is this? Nintendo was around at the same time Jack the Ripper was stalking the streets. Yeah, Nintendo's actually been around since the 80s. The 1880s. It was founded in 1889 in Japan by a craftsman named Fusijiro Yamauchi. Of course, the company really took off in 1981 with Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros. A few years later, but they started out making handcrafted playing cards in the late 1800s. The Ripper's spree was carried out in 1888, but not only was he still being whispered about in the streets and written about in the paper at the time, but there were several killings lasting into the early 1890s that some people speculated the Ripper was responsible for. Nintendo and Jack the Ripper, two things I would have never associated with each other. Very weird to picture a company that feels so contemporary, being around at the same time as the man who's often referred to as the first modern day serial killer. Star Wars and the Guillotine. Or Guillotine, some people say it either way. Star Wars, one of the first modern day blockbusters. It spawned a whole new genre of cinema. It's probably the most iconic film franchise in history. Star Wars is old by like Gen Z standards, like sure, but in the grand scheme of things, it's very modern. People are still fans to this day. Disney churns out subpar Star Wars content like every month, so it may be kind of surprising to learn that the first Star Wars movie came out the same year that France carried out its last execution by guillotine. Yeah, what a weird clash that is. A movie that helped spawn the modern special effects driven blockbusters full of actors that are still alive and working today, and an execution method that we often associate with this long forgotten time. But no, 1977 marked the end, apparently. In fact, it wasn't even abolished until 1981. 77 was just the final time it was actually used. McDonald's also has a bit of a connection to killing people, not because of how deadly the food is, but because the first McD's opened in 1940, just a year after the last public execution by guillotine was carried out in France. Keyword there being public. The one in 1977 wasn't public. How do you think folks in England traveled to check out the last public hanging in the country? By foot? Horse and buggy? Well, maybe, but another method of transportation would have been used. The subway. Yeah. Pretty weird to think about, but you could have taken the London Underground to watch England's last public hanging on May 26th of 1868. The Underground, which is now used by Londoners on the daily to get around the city, had already been operating for 5 years by then. It first opened in 1863, changing the way people traveled in London. And by 1868, public executions were still a thing, and a huge crowd gathered to watch the hanging of Michael Barrett, an Irish nationalist, outside Newgate Prison. Just imagine hopping on a tube train, which we associate heavily with modern life, to witness something as grim and old-fashioned as a public hanging. Feels like two different worlds colliding a little bit. Today we see the subway as this symbol of progress and everyday convenience, but public hangings, just like the guillotine I mentioned earlier, feels like a more dark, distant part of our history. Just goes to show that there really isn't this clear cutoff between what's old in our history and what's new. There's a lot more overlap than we often think, which I mean, of course there is. Time is just this ever-flowing thing, but it's just weird when you step back and you put it all into perspective. Does it get any more delicious than an Oreo cookie? Even in a life and death situation, I could go for one of these. Too bad those violent players on the Titanic didn't have an Oreo cookie to bite into right before playing out their last tune as the ship started to go down. Turns out they could have though. The first Oreo cookie was sold the same year the Titanic sunk. In fact, Oreo came out about a month before 1,500 people died in the accident. But as my buddy told me the day he got back from his grandfather's funeral, I did get these nice dress pants out of it, so you win some, you lose some. Now, I said the folks on the Titanic could have had an Oreo. It's not exactly true. They weren't available overseas yet. If they had made it to their destination, they could have tried one, but instead of dunking a delicious cookie in a cool glass of milk, they were dunked themselves into ice cold water, never to return. thus his life. Cleopatra, the legendary Egyptian queen, is often, rightfully so, associated with the pyramids, but she actually lived closer to a more modern historical event than the construction of the Great Pyramids. Believe it or not, but Cleopatra lived closer to the first moon landing than the building of the pyramids in Giza. How nuts is that to think about? She lived from 69 to 30 BC, but the pyramids had been constructed long before her, from about 2550 to 2490 BC. 1969 was closer by a pretty hefty chunk. The moon landing happened 1,999 years after her death, while the pyramids were completed 2,400 years before she was born. In this same vein, the pyramids were considered ancient to the ancient Romans. That's odd to think about too. Speaking of the pyramids, let's talk about woolly mammoths. Now I know what you're thinking out there. What do these things have to do with each other? Well, there were still woolly mammoths roaming around Earth while the pyramids were being built. That's how old the pyramids really are, which is why they're often regarded as one of the most incredible wonders of the world. I mean, no wonder some folks think there's just no way human beings constructed them on their own without some sort of outside assistance from some advanced alien species or something. A lot of people think the mammoths died about 10,000 years ago, and that was that, but a small number of them survived in several places for another 6,000 years or so. In fact, a population of woolly mammoths roamed Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia as recently as 3,700 years ago. So even centuries after the Great Pyramid of Giza and Stonehenge was completed, these prehistoric mammoths were still roaming the earth. What do you think is older, Oxford University or the Aztec Empire? Yeah, it's Oxford. It's pretty wild to think about, but Oxford University is actually older than the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, who are famous for their impressive temples and all their rich culture, they started building their capital city, Tenochtitlan, in 1325. That's the same place we now call Mexico City. Meanwhile, over in England, Oxford University had already been up and running since 1096. That's just crazy to think about. While Oxford students were hitting the books, the Aztecs were just beginning to lay the foundations of their empire. Mostly because today, Oxford is still very much around. New students arrive every year, while the Aztec Empire feels again like this long lost age where there are only these mysterious, esoteric remnants left behind. Weird to think about. You'd probably think anyone directly associated with the Civil War died a long time ago, but that is not the case with Helen Viola Jackson. She was born in 1916 and was the last surviving widow of a Civil War veteran. And when did she die? 4 years ago. She died in 2020 at the age of 101. Helen was just a young girl during the Great Depression when she met James Bolin, a much older man who had fought for the Union in the Civil War. And by older, I mean crazy older. Helen was 17, Bolin was 93. They got married. Don't worry though, it's not as icky as it sounds. This was a purely practical marriage. Helen's family was struggling, and Bolin didn't want to go into a home. He asked Helen to marry him so she could have his military pension after he passed away. It was a mutually beneficial thing and actually happened more than you'd probably think. They cared about each other, sure, but not in that way. At least, I don't think. I hope not. Helen never talked much about the marriage. She kept it a secret for a lot of years because she was just worried about what other people would think, and I mean, fair enough. It wasn't until she was much older that she started sharing her story, revealing a personal connection to a war that ended over 150 years before she died. Mike the Headless Chicken. It sounds like the title of an adult comedy cartoon, but this is a true story. There should absolutely be a movie based on this though. Our story begins in 1945 in Colorado. A farmer named Lloyd Olson decides it's time to make some dinner, so he goes out to the yard to chop off the head of one of his chickens. Lloyd brings the axe down on a 5.5-month-old rooster named Mike, but instead of dropping dead like a normal chicken when its head is lobbed off, Mike just shakes it off and struts around like nothing happened. Lloyd's standing there probably thinking he's lost his mind, but Mike is just wandering around, bumping into things, of course, but mostly acting like a regular chicken. Turns out Lloyd had done some sloppy work and had missed the jugular vein, leaving one ear and most of Mike's brain stem intact. Instead of finishing the job though, Lloyd saw a golden opportunity. You see, there's a valuable lesson in this story, folks. Sometimes your biggest success can come from one simple mistake, like not chopping off a head properly in this instance. Lloyd starts feeding and watering Mike directly into his esophagus with a dropper, and Mike just kept on living day after day, week after week, and then word gets around, and soon enough Mike is a national sensation. Newspapers dub him Mike the Headless Chicken, and he goes on tour, making Lloyd a tidy little profit. And people pay good money to see the Headless Wonder. And Mike even lands a spot in Life magazine. He was living the high life. Mike became a legend in just 18 months, but sadly, the parties, the late nights, the fame, it was too much to handle, and he eventually choked on a kernel of corn. Finally, we have a very weird story from ancient Greece. Sounds more like something from an early 2000s gross-out comedy rather than an actual story from history. The 6th century BC philosopher Heraclitus was a major influence on philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Unfortunately for Heraclitus though, his legacy will always be stained by his bizarre and rather revolting death. That's putting it very lightly. He suffered from, at the time, what was called dropsy, where fluid accumulates in the body. And Heraclitus tried to get help from physicians at first, but he wasn't really convinced of their conventional treatments. So instead he covered himself in cow dung, which, I mean, that's an alternative. That's one way of going about it. His idea was that the heat generated from the dung would somehow help evaporate all the excess fluid in his body, but of course this did not work. There's some debate as to whether he just died of his condition, covered in excrement, or if things got even worse. Some versions of the story go that he met an even more grisly fate, becoming trapped in the dung, either because it dried up or because it acted a bit like quicksand, and when he tried to call out for help, a gang of rabid dogs rushed over and devoured him, which would not have been a very tasty meal. Well, with all of that said, I've been your host James. I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.